The New Mexico Territory in the 1880s was not a place that welcomed strangers. It was a land of broken earth, violent winds, and a sun that seemed intent on bleaching the hope out of anything living. Clara Whitmore realized this the moment she stepped down from the dusty stagecoach and looked upon the jagged horizon of the basin. She had traveled 2,000 miles from a damp, gray city in the east, clutching a letter of proposal that promised a life of dignity and purpose. She had come to be a wife. By the time the buckboard wagon delivered her to the front gates of the Double L Ranch, Clara's silk traveling dress was coated in a fine layer of red dust. The estate of Archibald Lockett was sprawling, a testament to a man who had wrestled wealth from the desert through sheer force of will. The main house stood like a fortress against the wind, built of heavy timber and stone, with a wide porch that offered no shade, only a vantage point for surveillance. Archibald Lockett stood on that porch. He did not smile. He did not descend the steps to offer her a hand. He watched her struggle with her heavy trunk, his thumbs hooked into a belt made of expensive leather. He was a man of 50, with a face like cured beef and eyes that were sharp, assessing, and entirely devoid of warmth. Clara stood at the bottom of the stairs, her heart hammering a nervous rhythm against her ribs. She smoothed her skirts and looked up, waiting for the welcome she had rehearsed in her mind. "Mr. Lockett," she said, her voice trembling slightly in the dry air. "I am Clara." He looked her over, staring at her boots and dragging his gaze slowly up to the bonnet that shadowed her pale face. He nodded once, sharp and dismissive. "You are thinner than you said in your letters," he remarked. His voice was like gravel grinding under a boot heel. "Go around the back, Mrs. Gable will show you where you sleep." Clara blinked, the heat rising in her cheeks. "The back, but surely, around the back," he repeated, turning his back on her to watch a group of hands breaking a colt in the corral. "I have work to do, and now, so do you." That was the beginning of the lie. Clara had expected a wedding within the week. She had expected a parlor where she might read, a garden she might tend, and a husband she might learn to love. Instead, she was given a narrow cot in a room hardly larger than a pantry, situated off the kitchen where the heat of the wood stove was suffocating. On her first full day, she dressed in her best gown, a soft blue muslin, intending to join Mr. Lockett for breakfast. When she entered the dining room, Archibald looked up from his plate of steak and eggs with genuine irritation. "What are you wearing?" he asked. My morning dress, sir," Clara stammered. "You cannot scrub a floor in silk and lace, girl," he snapped. "Go find something rough, and if you have nothing rough, ask Mrs. Gable for an apron large enough to cover that vanity. You start with the hallway. Then the linens." Clara stood frozen. "Scrub? Mr. Lockett, I came here to be your wife." Archibald set his fork down with a deliberate clatter. He stood up and walked toward her, his heavy boots thudding on the pine floorboards. He towered over her, smelling of tobacco and bay rum. "You came here because I paid for your ticket," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "I paid for your passage. I paid for the food you ate on the way. I own the debt of you. Clara Whitmore. A wife is a partner. You are an investment. Until you prove you are worth the bread you eat, you are simply hands to work. Do you understand?" Clara felt the blood drain from her face. The cruelty of it was so sudden, so absolute, that she could not find the breath to argue. She nodded. Once, terrified. From that hour on, Clara ceased to be a bride. She became a shadow in the house of Archibald Lockett. The days blurred into a cycle of exhaustion. Her hands, once soft and stained only by ink, became red and blistered. She hauled water from the pump until her shoulders screamed. She plucked chickens until the smell of wet feathers seemed permanently etched into her skin. She scrubbed the pine floors on her knees until they shone, only to have Archibald walk across them with muddy boots, not even glancing down as she scrambled to wipe the filth away. He never touched her, not in the way a man touches a woman he desires. He did not call her to his bed. In fact, he seemed to derive a specific, twisted pleasure from ignoring her humanity entirely. When guests came, wealthy cattle buyers from Texas or politicians from Santa Fe, Clara was made to serve the wine and clear the plates. "Is this your niece?" one visitor asked, eyeing Clara as she poured claret into a crystal glass. Archibald laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "Just help. Found her back east. She has a debt to work off." The humiliation burned hotter than the desert sun. Clara kept her eyes on the table, her hand steady through sheer force of will, though inside she was screaming. The only other woman in the house was Mrs. Gable, the cook. She was a sour woman with a face like a dried apple and hands that were twisted with arthritis. She watched Clara with a mixture of pity and disdain. One evening, 3 weeks into Clara's servitude, they were alone in the kitchen. Clara was peeling a mountain of potatoes, her fingers raw. "You ain't the first, you know," Mrs. Gable said abruptly. She was kneading dough, attacking the flour with violent punches. Clara looked up. "The first thing? The first bride he bought, Mrs. Gable spat the word bride as if it were a curse. "There was a girl from Chicago 2 years back. Pretty thing, blonde. She lasted 4 months. "What happened to her?" Clara asked, her stomach twisting. Mrs. Gable shrugged. "Vanished. Lockett said she took a horse and rode off." "But that girl didn't know a saddle from a soup spoon. And the desert, well, the desert doesn't give things back." She paused and looked Clara dead in the eye. "If you have any sense, girl, you'll keep your head down. Do what he says. Don't make him angry. He breaks things that don't bend." Clara did not sleep that night. She lay on her cot, listening to the coyotes yip and howl in the distance, feeling the walls of the house closing in on her like the lid of a coffin. She was trapped. She had no money, no horse, and no knowledge of the land that stretched out for hundreds of miles in every direction. Then came the month of wind. The season turned, and the sky bruised purple and green. The wind began to blow without ceasing, a constant, maddening drone that drove men to drink and cattle to madness. The dust found its way through every crack in the window frames, coating the furniture, the food, and the sheets in a fine, gritty powder. It was on the 3rd day of a relentless gale that Archibald's cruelty shifted from cold indifference to something hotter and more terrifying. He had been drinking whiskey since noon. Clara could smell it on him from across the parlor where she was dusting the mantel. The other hands were out on the range, trying to keep the herd from scattering in the wind. The house was empty, save for them and Mrs. Gable, who was hiding in the pantry. "Clara," Archibald said. He was sprawled in a leather armchair, watching her. She did not turn. "Yes, Mr. Lockett. Come here." She gripped the feather duster tighter. "I have not finished the hearth, sir." "The hearth can wait. I said come here." Clara turned slowly. Archibald's face was flushed, his eyes glassy. He looked at her not as a servant, but as a possession he had neglected to use. "You stand there in that dress," he slurred. "I paid for that dress. Did you know that? $50 for the silk. Another $100 for your ticket." He stood up, swaying slightly. "I think it is time I collected some interest on my investment." Clara took a step back, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Mr. Lockett, please, you are not yourself." "I am exactly myself," he growled, lunging forward. He caught her wrist. His grip was iron hard. Clara gasped, dropping the duster. She tried to pull away, but he jerked her toward him, his other hand grasping at the fabric of her bodice. "You belong to me," he hissed, his breath hot and foul against her face. "You are mine. I bought you." "No!" Clara screamed. She did not think. She reacted. She brought her heel down hard on the arch of his boot. Archibald roared in surprise and pain, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. It was enough. Clara wrenched her arm free and ran. She did not run to her room. There was no lock on the door. She ran for the back door, throwing it open and plunging into the chaos of the storm. The wind hit her like a physical blow, nearly knocking her off her feet. The air was a swirling wall of brown grit that stung her eyes and filled her mouth. She could not see the gate. She could not see the road. She could only see the dark, looming shape of the main barn 50 yards away. She ran toward it, bent double against the gale, the sand scouring her skin. Behind her, she heard the door of the house slam against the wall, but the wind stole any sound of Archibald's pursuit. She reached the barn door, heaved the heavy latch, and slipped inside, pushing it shut with all her weight. The silence inside was sudden and profound. The wind still howled outside, battering the walls, but here the air was still, thick with the scent of sweet hay, cured leather, and horses. It was dim, lit only by a single kerosene lantern hanging from a hook on a central post. Clara leaned against the door, gasping for air, trembling so violently her knees threatened to give way. She wiped the grit from her eyes and looked around, terrified that Archibald would burst through the wood at any moment. But she was not alone. At the far end of the aisle, a man was standing by a stall. He was saddling a large roan gelding. He had stopped mid-motion, his hand resting on the stirrup leather, watching her. Clara froze. It was not one of the ranch hands she recognized. This man was taller, leaner. He wore a duster coat that had seen years of hard weather, the canvas stained and frayed at the hems. His hat was pulled low, but in the lantern light, she could see his face. It was a face that told a history of violence. A jagged pale scar ran from his left temple, cutting across his cheekbone and disappearing into his beard. His nose had been broken at least once, but it was his eyes that held her. They were dark, set deep beneath his brow, and they held a stillness that was entirely at odds with the storm raging outside. He did not speak. He simply watched her, his hands steady on the saddle. Clara pushed herself off the door, smoothing her hair with shaking hands. I am sorry," she whispered, though she knew he could barely hear her over the wind. "I did not know anyone was in here." The man turned back to his horse, tightening the cinch with a fluid, practicing motion. "It is a barn, ma'am, usually where the horses are." His voice was a low rumble, rough like sandpaper, but not unkind. Clara took a hesitant step forward. You work for Mr. Lockett?" "Not anymore," the man said. He checked the stirrup length. "Just packing my gear. You are leaving. In this storm." He looked at her again. The scar on his face pulled slightly as his expression tightened. "Weather is just weather. A man stays where he is welcome. I ain't welcome here." Clara hugged her arms around herself, suddenly conscious of the way her dress was torn at the shoulder where Archibald had grabbed her. "Why?" she asked. "What happened?" The cowboy picked up a bedroll and began to tie it behind the saddle. He moved with a deliberate, quiet economy. "Lockett has a way of treating men like dogs. I saw him giving a whip to a young Mexican boy yesterday. One of the stable hands. The boy dropped a saddle. It wasn't right." He paused, his hands stilling on the leather ties. "I stepped in," he said simply. "Took the whip from him. Told him that was enough." Clara stared at him. She knew Archibald's temper. She could only imagine the fury of him being defied by a hired hand. "He fired you?" The man gave a short, humorless laugh. "He told me to be off his land by sunset, or he would bury me on it. So, I am going." He turned fully toward her then. He took off his hat, revealing hair that was dark and matted with sweat and dust. He looked exhausted, beaten down by a life that had clearly not been kind. Yet he stood with a straight spine. "My name is Elias," he said. "Elias McCrae." "Clara," she said softly. "Clara Whitmore." Elias nodded. His gaze dropped to her torn dress, then back to her eyes. He did not ask what had happened. He seemed to know. The bruise was likely already forming on her wrist. "You should not be out here, Miss Clara," he said. "Lockett will be looking." "I cannot go back in there," she said, the words tumbling out in a panic. "I cannot. He thinks he owns me." Elias watched her for a long moment. The wind slammed against the barn siding, making the timbers groan. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a canteen. He uncorked it and held it out to her. "Drink," he said. "You have dust in your throat." Clara took the canteen. Her hands shook so much that water spilled down her chin. It was lukewarm and tasted of tin, but it was the best thing she had ever tasted. She handed it back. "Thank you." Elias took a sip himself, then stopped it. He leaned back against the stall door, crossing his arms. He did not seem in a hurry to leave anymore. "He is a bad man," Elias said quietly. "A man with a hole inside him that he tries to fill with money and fear. But it never fills." Clara sank down onto a bale of hay, her legs finally giving out. "I came here to be his wife," she confessed, the shame burning in her chest. "I answered an advertisement. I thought I was coming home." "New Mexico is a hard place for dreams," Elias said. He didn't offer false comfort. He didn't tell her it would be all right. He just stated the truth. "I have nowhere to go," she whispered. "I have no money. He told me I have to work off my debt. He makes me scrub the floors. He introduces me as the help." She looked up at Elias, tears cutting tracks through the dust on her face. "I am educated. I speak French. I can play the piano. And now I am a prisoner." Elias looked at her, his dark eyes unreadable. He walked over to where she sat and knelt down on one knee, bringing himself to her eye level, up close. She could see the gray in his stubble, the fine lines of pain etched around his mouth. He smelled of rain and tobacco and horses. "You ain't a prisoner," he said firmly. "Doors open both ways. It is just walking through them that is hard." "I cannot walk across a desert," she said. "No," he agreed. "Not alone." They sat in silence for a long time as the storm raged. The barn felt like a small boat adrift in a hurricane. Elias did not touch her, but his presence was a solid anchor. He told her, in halting sentences, about the places he had been, the high mountains of Colorado, the flat plains of Kansas. He spoke of the war, briefly, and the shadow in his eyes deepened. He spoke of a life spent drifting, never belonging, always moving on before the roots could take hold. Clara listened, and for the first time since arriving at the Double L Ranch, she felt seen. This rough, scarred man with nothing to his name but a horse and a saddle was treating her with more respect in a dusty barn than Archibald Lockett had in his velvet parlor. The wind began to die down, the howling fading to a low moan. The danger of the moment returned. Archibald would be sobering up. He would be coming. Elias stood up. He put his hat back on, pulling the brim low. "A storm is breaking," he said. "I have to ride. If he finds me here, there will be a shooting." Panic seized Clara's chest. She stood up, reaching out to grab his sleeve. "You are leaving? I have to. Take me with you," she said. The words were out before she could think them through. Elias looked down at her hand on his arm. He shook his head slowly. "Miss Clara, I have $20 in my pocket and a bounty on my head in 2 counties. I sleep on the ground. I eat hardtack. That ain't a life for a lady like you." "I am not a lady anymore," she said fiercely. "Look at me. Elias. Look at my hands." She held them up, palms out, showing the calluses and the raw, red skin. "I am not a lady, and I am certainly not a servant." She took a breath, her voice steadying, gaining a steel she did not know she possessed. "I will not go back to that house. I will not let him touch me. I would rather die in the arroyo than scrub his floors for another day." Elias looked at her hands. Then he looked at her face. He saw the fire in her eyes, the desperation, and the dignity that Archibald Lockett had failed to break. He saw a woman who was terrified but standing tall. Something shifted in his expression. The guardedness fell away, replaced by a profound, quiet intensity. He looked at the saddle on his horse, then back to her. "You mean that?" he asked softly. "You are not a servant?" "No," she said. "I am not." Elias stepped closer. The space between them vanished. The air in the barn seemed to charge with a sudden, electric heat. He reached out, his rough, calloused hand hovering for a moment before gently brushing a stray lock of hair from her forehead. His touch was impossibly tender. "Then be my wife," he whispered. "Starting tonight." Clara stared at him in silence. The world outside had stopped. There was only the lantern light, the smell of hay, and this man who was offering her the only thing he had, his protection, his name, And his life, she trembled, not from fear, but from a sudden, overwhelming release. Yes, she breathed. Elias didn't smile, but his eyes softened. He opened his arms, and Clara, without a second thought, stepped into them. He held her tight, his chin resting on the top of her head, his arms a fortress against the world. For the first time in months. Clara closed her eyes and felt safe. "Pack a bag," Elias said against her hair. "Small. Whatever you can carry. We ride at dawn." The gray light of pre-dawn was a ghostly shroud over the Double L Ranch when Clara Whitmore slipped through the kitchen door for the last time. She carried only a small carpet bag containing a spare shift, a comb, her mother's Bible, and a knife she had stolen from the pantry. Her boots, ill-suited for stealth, made soft thuds against the packed earth of the yard. But the wind, which had finally died down to a whisper, seemed to hold its breath for her. Elias was waiting by the corral. He had secured a second mount, a sturdy paint mare with a calm eye, likely taken from the string of working horses. He did not speak as Clara approached. He simply took her bag, tied it to the saddle strings, and offered his cupped hands to help her mount. As Clara placed her foot in his hands and swung up into the saddle, she felt the heat of his palms through the leather of her boot. It was the first time they had touched since the barn, a silent reaffirmation of the pact they had made in the dark. Elias swung onto his own roan gelding, the leather creaking softly. He looked at her, his face shadowed beneath the brim of his hat, and nodded toward the open gate. They rode out on a walk to keep the dust down, moving like phantoms through the sagebrush until the ranch house was nothing but a dark smudge against the brightening horizon. Only when the sun breached the eastern ridge, painting the desert floor in violent hues of orange and blood red, did Elias urge the horses into a trot. They did not stop until the sun was high and white, burning a hole in the center of the sky. The first 3 days were a blur of physical agony and silent awe. Clara had thought she knew exhaustion from scrubbing Archibald Lockett's floors, but the trail was a different beast entirely. The sun was a physical weight, a hammer that struck the back of her neck without mercy. Her thighs were raw from the saddle, her skin chapped by the dry air, and her lips cracked and bled. They traveled through a landscape that was as magnificent as it was indifferent to their survival. Great mesas of red rock rose from the earth like ruined cathedrals. Canyons sliced through the ground, revealing layers of time in bands of ochre and violet. It was a vast, empty silence that made Clara feel impossibly small. They camped that third night in the lee of a limestone overhang. Elias built a small fire, more for the comfort of the light than for warmth, though the desert temperature plummeted the moment the sun vanished. They ate meagerly, a strip of dried beef that tasted of salt and iron, and a heel of stale bread Elias had packed. He sat across the fire from her, tending to his pistol. He disassembled it with blind familiarity, wiping the dust from the cylinder with an oiled rag. "You ride well enough for a city woman," Elias said. It was the first compliment he had given her, though his tone remained flat and practical. Clara shifted, trying to find a comfortable position on the hard ground. "I rode in the park. In Philadelphia, it was different. We wore velvet habits and rode side saddle, and there was always a groom following 10 paces behind." Elias looked up, the firelight catching the jagged scar on his cheek. "No grooms out here, Clara, just us and the coyotes." "Where are we going?" she asked. It was a question she had been too afraid to ask until now, fearing the answer might be nowhere. "West," Elias said. "Toward the Arizona line. The territory is wilder there. Harder for a man like Lockett to send a posse. We will find a town where people don't ask questions, and we will work." "Work," Clara repeated. She looked at her hands, stained with red dust. "I am not afraid of work. Elias, I just want to be free." "Freedom costs," Elias said quietly. He reassembled the pistol with a sharp click. "Out here, you buy it with sweat and sometimes blood. Tomorrow, I will teach you how to shoot. If we get separated, or if I fall, you need to know how to put a man down." The lesson the next morning was brutal and loud. Elias set up a dried piece of cactus wood on a fence post of an abandoned homestead they passed. He stood behind her, adjusting her grip on the heavy Colt revolver. "Do not lock your elbows," he instructed, his voice right at her ear. "The kick will hurt you if you are stiff. Let your body absorb it. Breathe out. Squeeze. Do not pull." Clara fired. The explosion was deafening, the recoil shocking her arms all the way to the shoulders. The bullet kicked up dust 5 feet to the left of the target. "Again," Elias said. She fired until her wrist ached and her ears rang. She fired until she finally splintered the wood. When she did, she turned to look at him, a fierce grin breaking through the dust on her face. Elias didn't smile, but he nodded. "Good," he said. "Now reload it. A gun is just a club if it is empty." As they rode deeper into the wilderness, the silence between them began to fill with stories. It was a slow unspooling of their pasts, offered up in fragments as they rode shoulder to shoulder. Clara spoke first, driven by the need to explain why a woman of her breeding had ended up sold like cattle. "My father was a banker," she told him one afternoon as they watered the horses at a trickling spring. "We had servants. We had a summer home. I was raised to be decorative. Elias, to play Chopin and speak French in embroidery slippers." Elias watched the horses drink. "Sounds like a soft life." "It was a cage," Clara said, her voice sharp. "I was 22 and unmarried. In my circle, that made me a failure. My father tried to marry me off to a widower 3 times my age, a man with cold hands and a wet mouth. I refused. I told my father I would rather starve." She laughed bitterly. "He told me I was ungrateful, that I was broken. So I left. I took the little money I had and answered an ad in the paper. Archibald Lockett wrote beautiful letters. He quoted poetry. Words are cheap," Elias murmured. "I learned that," she said. "But I suppose I was running away from one prison only to walk into another. I have always been disobedient. My mother said, 'Too much fire for a parlor.'" Elias looked at her then, his dark eyes searching her face. "Fire is good. Clara, fire keeps you alive out here. A parlor is just a box to keep a woman quiet." 2 nights later, under a canopy of stars so thick they looked like spilled milk, Elias offered his own confession. He had been quiet all evening, staring into the embers of their fire, his shoulders tight with a tension Clara could not name. "You asked about my scar," he said suddenly. Clara looked up from mending a tear in her skirt. "I did not ask. I wondered." Elias touched the jagged line that ran from his temple to his jaw. "Cavalry saber. I was a soldier. 3rd Cavalry." Clara went still. The Indian Wars were a fresh wound in the West, a history written in smoke and blood. "I thought I was doing right," Elias said, his voice hollow. "I was young. I believed what they told us about civilizing the frontier, about protecting settlers." He picked up a handful of dirt and let it sift through his fingers. "But it wasn't protection. It was a slaughter." He looked at her, and the pain in his eyes was a physical thing, raw and bleeding. "We rode into a village at dawn. Winter. They were sleeping. The captain gave the order. He said leave nothing standing. I saw things, Clara, that took the soul right out of me. Women, children." His voice broke. He looked away, toward the dark emptiness of the desert. "I tried to stop a private from burning a lodge. That was when the sergeant slashed me, called me an Indian lover. I deserted 3 days later. I have been running ever since. From the army, from the law, from myself, mostly." Clara moved then. She crawled across the small space between them and took his hand. His fingers were rough, calloused, and trembling slightly. She held them between her own soft palms. "You are not that man," she whispered fiercely. "The man who saved me in the barn. The man who is guiding me now. That is who you are." Elias looked at their joined hands, then up at her. "I ain't clean. Clara, I have blood on me that won't wash off." "We are all dirty out here, Elias," she said. "We just have to keep walking until the rain comes." The heat wave struck the next day. The temperature soared, baking the air until it shimmered like liquid glass. They had descended into a lower basin. a stretch of alkali flats where the waterholes had dried to cracked mud. Clara began to falter around noon. The world started to tilt and sway. The horizon spun. Her head throbbed with a violence that made her nauseous. She tried to grip the saddle horn, but her fingers felt numb, detached from her body. "Elias," she croaked. He turned in his saddle just as she slid sideways. He was off his horse before she hit the ground, catching her half in his arms, half against his chest. "Clara!" His voice sounded far away, as if he were speaking from the bottom of a well. "So hot," she mumbled. The walls are closing in." She lost time then. The world became a fever dream of lurching motion and searing heat. She was aware of being lifted, of the horse moving beneath her, of Elias's arm like an iron band around her waist, holding her upright. When she woke, it was dark, or rather, dim. Above her was stone, rough, cool limestone. She was lying on a bedroll. Something cool and wet touched her forehead. She gasped, her eyes flying open. Elias was hovering over her. His face was pale beneath the tan, his eyes wide with fear. He was dabbing her face with a rag soaked in precious water. "Easy," he whispered. "Easy. Now." You took a turn. Heat exhaustion. Clara tried to sit up, but her body felt like it was made of water. She collapsed back onto the blanket. "Where?" "A cave," Elias said. "Found an old washout near a dry riverbed. It is cooler here. Drink." He lifted her head gently and held a canteen to her lips. She drank greedily, the water spilling down her chin. He wiped it away with his thumb, his touch lingering on her skin. She lay there for hours as the fever burned itself out. Elias did not sleep. He sat beside her, changing the cool cloth on her head, holding her hand when she cried out in her delirium. She dreamt of Archibald Lockett, of his heavy boots and cruel hands. And she thrashed, calling out, "I am here." Elias's voice cut through the nightmare. "He is not here. I am here. You are safe. Clara, you are safe." By the next evening, the fever had broken. Clara was weak, but her mind was clear. She sat at the mouth of the cave, watching the sun dip below the canyon rim. The sky was a bruise of purple and gold, the first stars pricking the velvet darkness above. Elias was tending the horses nearby. He walked over, seeing her sitting up, and the relief that washed over his face was so profound it made Clara's heart ache. "You gave me a scare," he said, sitting down on a rock beside her. "I am sorry to be a burden," Clara said softly. "Stop that," Elias said, his voice sharp. "You ain't a burden. You're my partner. We rode together. If I fall, you pick me up. If you fall, I carry you. That is the way of it?" Clara looked at him. He looked exhausted. Shadows circled his eyes, and his clothes were stained with dust and sweat. Yet, to her, he was the most beautiful thing in the world. He was solid. He was real. He was the only man who had ever looked at her and seen a person, not a prize or a servant. "Elias," she said. He turned to her. The air between them shifted, heavy with the memory of the fear they had just survived and the intimacy of the long, dark night. "Thank you," she whispered, "for saving me. Again." "I would do it 1,000 times," he said, his voice dropping to a rough murmur. Clara reached out and touched his face. Her fingers traced the line of his jaw, the rough stubble, the edge of the scar. He went very still, his breath catching in his throat. "Clara," he warned softly, "I am not a gentleman." "I do not want a gentleman," she said. "I want you." She leaned forward. He did not move, but his eyes darkened. She closed the distance, pressing her lips to his. It was hesitant at first, a question asked in the twilight. His lips were dry and tasted of salt. But then he made a low sound in his throat, a groan of surrendered control, and his hand came up to cup the back of her neck. The kiss deepened, becoming hungry, desperate. It was the taste of survival, of two lonely souls colliding in the vast emptiness of the world. They broke apart, breathless. Elias rested his forehead against hers. His hands were trembling. "I have nothing to give you," he whispered. "No home, no money, just this hard life. "You gave me my life back," Clara said. She pulled back to look him in the eye. "And now I want to live it." She took his hand and led him back into the shadows of the cave. The air inside was cool and smelled of ancient earth. She stood before him and began to undo the buttons of her bodice. Her fingers shook, not with fear, but with a terrifying, wonderful anticipation. Elias watched her, his gaze reverent, as if he were witnessing a miracle. When she stood before him in her chemise, the pale cotton glowing in the dim light, he fell to his knees. He pressed his face against her stomach, wrapping his arms around her waist, holding her as if she were the only solid thing in a spinning universe. Clara ran her hands through his hair, pulling him closer. She needed this. She needed to wash away the memory of Archibald's possessive grip, the feeling of being a servant, a thing. She needed to be a woman who chose. "Elias," she whispered. "Please." He stood up then and undressed with fumble-fingered haste. When skin finally met skin, it was a shock of heat. They sank onto the bedroll, the hard ground beneath them forgotten. Their lovemaking was not practiced or polished. It was fierce. It was frantic. It was driven by the silence of the desert and the fear of the unknown tomorrows. Elias moved with a restraint that clearly cost him, trying to be gentle. But Clara met him with a ferocity that surprised them both. She clung to his shoulders, her nails digging into his skin, grounding herself in the reality of his muscle and bone. There were tears, mixed with kisses. There was the release of months of held breath. In the dark of that cave, with the wind sighing outside, they reclaimed themselves. Afterward, they lay tangled together under the rough wool blanket. The temperature had dropped, but their combined heat was a shield. Elias lay on his back, one arm thrown over his eyes, the other holding Clara close against his side. She rested her head on his chest, listening to the slow, steady thrum of his heart. The silence stretched, heavy and thoughtful. "I'm afraid," Elias said into the darkness. His voice was barely a whisper. Clara propped herself up on one elbow to look at him. "Afraid? You faced a cavalry charge. You faced Archibald Lockett." "That is different," Elias said. He moved his arm, looking up at her with a vulnerability that broke her heart. "I am afraid I won't be enough. For someone like you, you come from silk and libraries. Clara, I am just a broken soldier with a bounty on his head. One day, you might wake up and realize you traded a palace for a patch of dirt." Clara reached down and brushed a lock of hair from his forehead. She traced the scar on his cheek, seeing it not as a disfigurement, but as a map of his survival. "I never lived in a palace. Elias," she said softly, "I lived in a showroom. I was a doll on a shelf. Everyone looked at me, but no one saw me." She leaned down and kissed him, slow and deep, pouring every ounce of her certainty into the touch. "You are the only man who has ever seen me," she whispered against his lips. "Not the dress, not the name, me, and that is more than enough. That is everything." Elias let out a long, shuddering breath. He pulled her down to him, burying his face in the crook of her neck. And there, in the safety of the cave, the cowboy wept, and the bride held him, and the night watched over them both. The town of San Lazaro sat on the bleeding edge of the territory, a cluster of adobe buildings huddled against the wind like sheep in a storm. It was a place where the law was thin and the memory of men was short, located so close to the Arizona line that a man could spit and hit a different jurisdiction. For Clara and Elias, it was a sanctuary built of mud bricks and anonymity. They arrived with nothing but the horses they rode and the dust in their clothes. Yet they walked down the main street with heads held high, introducing themselves as Mr. and Mrs. McCrae. It was a lie that tasted sweet on Clara's tongue. To be a wife in name was one thing. To be a wife in the quiet, desperate intimacy of survival was another entirely. They rented a single room at the back of a boarding house run by a blind Mexican woman named Doña Elena. The room was small, with a floor of packed earth and walls that smelled of lime and damp straw. But to Clara, it was a palace because Archibald Lockett did not hold the key. Survival required reinvention. Clara, whose hands had once known only the ivory keys of a piano and the delicate spine of a French novel, found a new rhythm in the needle and thread. She purchased cheap calico and muslin with the last of Elias's coin and began to sew. She sat by the single window, catching the morning light, her fingers moving with a dexterity born of necessity. She sewed for the Mexican widows who lived on the south side of town, women who wore their grief in layers of black lace. She sewed christening gowns for babies born into the dust. She sewed sturdy shirts for the miners who came down from the silver lodes in the hills. Her stitches were small and even, a discipline she had once hated in the drawing rooms of Philadelphia, but now cherished as the means of their bread. Elias found work at the lumber yard on the edge of town. It was brutal labor, hauling rough-hewn timber from the wagons that came down from the high country. He spent his days straining against the weight of pine and oak, his muscles screaming, splinters working their way into his calloused palms. When the lumber work was slow, he went to the livery stable and broke horses for the owner, a man named Silas, who paid $2 for every colt that could be ridden to a standstill. Elias had a way with the animals. He did not break them with whips or spurs as the other men did. He used his voice, a low, steady rumble that seemed to vibrate in the chest of the terrified beast. He used patience. He used the quiet authority of a man who understood fear because he lived with it every day. Their life settled into a routine that was exhausting and beautiful. In the evenings, Elias would come home smelling of pine resin and horse sweat. Clara would have a stew simmering on the small iron stove in the corner, usually made of beans and chilies and whatever cheap cut of meat the butcher had sold her for pennies. They would eat at the crate they used for a table, their knees touching in the cramped space. Afterward, by the light of a single tallow candle, they would read. Clara had found a tattered copy of a book of sonnets in the general store, trading a mended shirt for it. She would read aloud to Elias as he whittled or mended his tack. "Let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments," she read one night, her voice soft in the stillness. Elias looked up from the piece of leather he was oiling. His face was cleaner now, though the scar was still a stark white line against his tanned skin. He looked younger when he looked at her. "That is a lot of fancy words for saying love is hard work," he noted, a small smile touching the corner of his mouth. "It means love does not change when it finds change," Clara corrected gently. "It means it endures the storms." Elias reached across the crate and took her hand. His palm was rough, his grip solid. "We have had our share of storms, Mrs. McCrae, and we are still standing," she replied, squeezing his fingers. Nights were their fortress. In the narrow bed with its corn husk mattress, they whispered secrets they had never told another living soul. Clara told him about the cold silence of her father's house, where laughter was treated as a breach of etiquette. Elias told her about the smell of gunpowder on a frozen morning and the faces of the men he had buried. They offered these jagged pieces of themselves to each other, and in the exchange, the sharp edges seemed to dull. Laughter, once a stranger to both of them, began to live in the adobe room. It came when Elias tried to sew a button on his shirt and pinned the fabric to his own trousers. It came when Clara tried to make tortillas and they ended up shaped like the map of Texas. It was a breathless, surprised laughter that felt like rain in a drought. But the shadow of the Double L Ranch stretched long, even across 200 miles of desert. It was a Tuesday in late October when the illusion shattered. The air had turned crisp, carrying the scent of burning pinon wood from the chimneys of the town. Clara was walking toward the mercantile to buy thread, a basket hooked over her arm. A carriage was pulled up in front of the saloon. It was not the dusty buckboard of a local rancher or the mud-spattered stagecoach. It was a phaeton, painted a glossy black, with red pinstripes and wheels that looked recently washed. The horses hitched to it were prime stock, high-headed bays with silver on their bridles. Clara froze. Her heart slammed against her ribs. A sudden, violent drum. She knew that carriage. She had seen it parked in the driveway of Archibald Lockett's estate. It belonged to the foreman, a man named Vance Kincaid. Kincaid was a man who enjoyed his work, especially when his work involved hurting things. He was Archibald's right hand, his enforcer, a man who tracked runaways, cattle or human, with the cold persistence of a wolf. Clara stepped back into the shadow of an alleyway, pressing her back against the rough adobe. Her breath came in shallow gasps. She watched as the saloon doors swung open and Kincaid stepped out. He was wearing a long duster and a flat-brimmed hat. He paused on the boardwalk, lighting a cigar, his eyes scanning the street with predatory laziness. He turned to a man standing next to him, a local drunk who swept the saloon floors. Clara could not hear the words, but she saw Kincaid make a gesture with his hand. He held it at the height of a woman's shoulder. He touched his own hair, indicating a color, red. The drunk nodded and pointed vaguely toward the south side of town, toward the widows, toward where Clara sold her dresses. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded Clara's veins. She turned and ran. She did not run to the boarding house. She ran to the lumber yard. Elias was hoisting a stack of planks onto a wagon when he saw her. He dropped the wood with a clatter that made the horses jump. He saw the terror in her face, the way her chest heaved, and he was vaulting over the fence before she even reached the gate. "Clara?" He caught her by the shoulders. "What is it? Are you hurt?" "He is here," she gasped, gripping the front of his shirt. "Kincaid, the foreman." Elias went still. The warmth left his eyes, replaced by a flat, deadly focus. "You saw him?" "The carriage, black with red stripes. He was asking about a red-haired woman. Elias, he knows." Elias looked around the yard. It was midday. People were watching. He took her arm and pulled her behind a stack of timber. Out of sight. "Listen to me," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Go back to the room. Pack the bag. Do not light a fire. I will collect my pay. We will buy supplies and ride out tonight, as soon as the moon is down." Clara stared at him. The fear was there. Yes, churning in her gut. But beneath the fear, something else was rising. A hot, hard knot of anger. She thought of the room with the lime-washed walls. She thought of the dress she was sewing for Mrs. Ramirez's daughter. She thought of the way Elias laughed when she read poetry. "No," she said. Elias blinked, as if she had spoken in a foreign tongue. "Clara, we cannot stay. Kincaid will not stop. If he finds us, we run," she interrupted. "And then we run again, and again, until we are old or dead in a ditch. I am done running. Elias." "This is not about pride," Elias hissed, gripping her arms tighter. "This is about keeping you alive. Lockett does not just want you back. He wants to punish you. And Kincaid. You do not know what that man is capable of." "I know what I am capable of," Clara said. She pulled away from him, standing tall. Her hands were shaking, but her chin was lifted. "I have built a life here. It is a small life, maybe, but it is ours. I am not a servant anymore, and I am not a fugitive. I am your wife. Clara, we will not hide in the dark," she said firmly. "This is our town now. If they want to fight, then let them come. But I will not pack that bag. I will not sleep on the ground and starve because Archibald Lockett thinks he owns the world." Elias looked at her, torn between terror for her safety and a fierce, reluctant admiration. He saw the steel in her spine, the same steel that had made her walk out of the ranch house into a sandstorm. "You are a stubborn woman, Clara McCrae," he said softly. "I have to be." She replied, "I am married to a stubborn man." He let out a long breath, running a hand over his face. "All right, we stay, but you do not go out alone, not until Kincaid is gone. You stay in the room." "I have to buy thread," she said. "Clara." "I have an order to finish. Mrs. Ramirez needs the dress for Sunday Mass. I will go to the mercantile. I will buy my thread, and I will come home. I will not let them make me a prisoner in my own home again." She turned and walked away before he could stop her. Elias watched her go, swearing softly under his breath. He turned back to the foreman of the lumberyard. "I am done for the day," he said. "You got 2 hours left." The foreman barked. "Keep the pay," Elias said, grabbing his coat. He followed Clara, keeping a distance, his hand hovering near the knife at his belt. He did not have his gun. It was back in the room, a mistake he would not make again. Clara reached the market square. Her heart was hammering, but she forced herself to walk slowly. She would not run. She would not look like prey. She entered the mercantile, the bell above the door jingling cheerfully. The air inside smelled of coffee beans and dry goods. She moved to the counter where the spools of thread were displayed. She selected a spool of white cotton and a length of blue ribbon. Her hands were steady as she counted out the coins. "Afternoon, ma'am," the shopkeeper said. "Good afternoon, Mr. Henderson." She replied. She turned to leave, and the door opened. Vance Kincaid filled the doorway. He was a big man, thick through the shoulders, with a face that looked like it had been carved out of granite and left to weather. He wore a pistol on his hip, tied down low. He stopped. His eye swept the room and landed on Clara. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face, revealing teeth stained with tobacco. "Well, well," he drawled. His voice was like oil sliding over gravel. "If it isn't the little runaway bird." Clara went cold. She clutched her basket. "Excuse me," she said, trying to step around him. Kincaid moved with surprising speed. He blocked her path, his hands shooting out to grab her upper arm. His fingers dug into her flesh, bruising even through the fabric of her dress. "You cost Mr. Lockett a lot of money, girl," Kincaid said. "And you cost me a week of riding in the dust. I reckon you are coming with me." "Let me go," Clara shouted. She swung her basket at him, hitting him in the chest, but he didn't even flinch. "You have got some fight in you." Kincaid laughed. "Archibald said you needed braking. I might just enjoy the ride back." He yanked her toward the door. Clara dug her heels in, screaming for help. The shopkeeper stood frozen behind the counter, eyes wide with fear. No one moved. Kincaid was a dangerous man, and everyone knew it. "You are coming," Kincaid snarled, dragging her out onto the boardwalk. "And after I am done with you, I'm going to find that mongrel cowboy you ran off with and skin him alive. Let her go." The voice was a roar. Kincaid turned just in time to see Elias launching himself from the street. Elias did not stop to talk. He did not challenge Kincaid to a duel. He hit him with the momentum of a freight train. His shoulders slammed into Kincaid's chest, tearing his grip from Clara's arm and sending both men crashing into the dust of the street. Clara stumbled back, gasping, clutching her bruised arm. The two men rolled in the dirt. Kincaid was bigger, heavier, but Elias fought with a desperate, feral viciousness. He was not fighting for honor. He was fighting for Clara's life. Kincaid tried to draw his pistol, but Elias slammed his fist down onto the man's wrist. Hearing the bone crunch, Kincaid howled and dropped the gun. Elias straddled him. He rained blows down on Kincaid's face. "Left, right, left!" There was a sickening sound of flesh impacting flesh. Kincaid bucked, throwing Elias off, and scrambled to his feet. Blood pouring from his nose, Kincaid reached for a knife in his boot. Elias didn't wait. He stepped in close, ignoring the blade that slashed across his forearm, and drove a solid uppercut into Kincaid's jaw. The foreman's head snapped back. Elias followed it with a hook to the ribs that cracked like a dry branch. Kincaid went down to one knee, wheezing. Elias kicked him in the chest, sending him sprawling onto his back. Elias stood over him, chest heaving, blood dripping from his arm and his split knuckles. He looked ready to kill. He raised his boot to stomp on Kincaid's throat. "That is enough!" The shout came from the end of the street. Sheriff Miller was walking toward them, a double-barreled shotgun resting in the crook of his arm. He was an old man with a white mustache and eyes that had seen too much trouble to be impressed by it. Elias froze, his foot hovering. He looked at the sheriff, then at Clara, who was standing by the hitching post, pale and trembling. He slowly lowered his foot. The sheriff looked down at Kincaid, who was groaning and spitting blood into the dirt. Then he looked at Elias. "You embrace violence like an old friend." "Son," the sheriff said dryly. "He tried to take my wife," Elias said. His voice was ragged. "He put hands on her. The sheriff nudged Kincaid with the toe of his boot. "Is that true? Vance, you're snatching women off the street now?" Kincaid rolled onto his side, glaring up at them with one swollen eye. "She is stolen property. She belongs to Archibald Lockett, and this man is a horse thief." "I see a woman standing there," the sheriff said calmly. "She does not look like a horse to me, and in this town, folks do not belong to other folks." The war settled that particular question. "You are making a mistake, Miller," Kincaid spat. "Lockett owns this territory. He will burn this town down." "He might," the sheriff agreed. "But you won't be here to see it." He gestured with a shotgun toward the edge of town. "Get your carriage, get your teeth fixed, and get out of my jurisdiction. If I see you by sundown, I will let the cowboy finish what he started." Kincaid staggered to his feet. He looked at Elias, a look of pure, unadulterated hate. "This isn't over. McCrae, you are a dead man walking." He limped toward the livery stable. The sheriff turned to Elias. He looked at the blood on Elias's arm, and the fury still simmered in his eyes. "You stirred the hornet's nest," the sheriff said quietly. "I can run one bully out of town. I cannot stop an army. Lockett will send more men, harder men." "Let them come," Elias said. "Brave words." The sheriff sighed. "Just make sure you are ready to pay the price for them. Go home, son. Patch yourself up." Elias walked over to Clara. He did not speak. He put his uninjured arm around her shoulders, pulling her tight against him. She buried her face in his shirt, smelling the dust and the blood and the sweat. They walked back to the boarding house in silence, the town watching them with a mixture of awe and pity. Inside the adobe room, the adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a crushing ache. Elias sat on the edge of the bed. His shoulders slumped. His hands were a mess, knuckles split and swollen, turning purple. The cut on his forearm was deep and sluggishly bleeding. Clara lit the candle. Her hands were shaking, but she forced them to be steady. She poured water from the pitcher into a basin and tore a strip of clean muslin from her sewing basket. "Let me see," she whispered. Elias held out his hands. He hissed in breath as she dabbed the wet cloth against his raw knuckles. "I am sorry," he said, his voice rough. "I lost my head. When I saw him touch you." "Hush," Clara said. She kissed the palm of his hand, then his wrist. She cleaned the blood away with a tenderness that made her chest tight. "You saved me. You fought for me." "I made it worse," Elias said. "They will come back now, with rifles." "Then we will be ready," Clara said. She wrapped his arm, tying the bandage tight. "But tonight, you are here, and I am here." She finished the bandage and looked up at him. The candlelight flickered in his dark eyes. The fear was there, the terrible knowledge of what was coming. But beneath it was a hunger, a need to affirm that they were still alive, still breathing, still together. Elias reached out with his bandaged hand and touched her cheek. "Clara." It was a plea and a prayer. Clara blew out the candle, plunging the room into darkness. She moved into his arms, careful of his wounds but desperate for his weight. They fell back onto the bed. This was not the frantic, discovering passion of the cave. This was slower, deeper. It was the intimacy of people who have looked death in the face and walked away. Clara kissed the scar on his face. She kissed the pulse in his neck. She felt the tension in his muscles, the coiled spring of violence that he kept leashed for her sake. She pressed herself against him, skin to skin, needing to feel the heat of his blood to know that it was not spilling onto the ground. Elias held her as if she were made of glass that had already been shattered and glued back together. His movements were deliberate, heavy with emotion. He worshipped her body with a desperate thoroughness, trying to memorize the curve of her hip, the sound of her breath, the taste of her skin. Every touch was a defiance of Archibald Lockett. Every kiss was a claim. "Mine," his hands said, "mine." Her arching back answered, "I love you," she whispered in the dark, the words fierce and frightened. "I am yours," Elias answered, his voice breaking. "Until the last day, I am yours." They moved together in the rhythm of the night, urgent and terrified, and undeniably alive, building a memory strong enough to withstand the storm that was gathering on the horizon. The poster was nailed to the trunk of a dead cottonwood tree at the crossroads, the paper bleached white by the relentless sun. It fluttered in the dry wind, a ghost haunting the intersection of the dusty trail and the road to Tucson. Elias pulled his roan gelding up short. He leaned down from the saddle, his eyes narrowing beneath the brim of his hat. Clara, riding beside him on the paint mare, felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. She did not need to read the words to know what they said, but she read them anyway. Wanted, dead or alive. Elias McCrae, $500. Beneath the bold lettering was a crude sketch of his face, focused heavily on the scar that bisected his cheek, but it was the small print that made Clara's breath catch in her throat. For the crimes of grand larceny, assault with intent to kill, and the theft of household chattel belonging to Mr. Archibald Lockett. Household chattel, Clara whispered. The wind snatched the words from her lips. She felt a wave of nausea. She was not a wife in the eyes of the law, nor even a woman. She was furniture. She was livestock. She was a stolen thing to be returned to its owner. Elias reached out and ripped the poster from the tree. He crumpled it in his fist, his knuckles white, the fresh bandages from his fight with Kincaid straining against his skin. $500, Elias said, his voice flat and hard as slate. That is a lot of money. Clara, enough to make a good man turn his head and a bad man kill his own brother. We have to keep moving, Clara said, her voice trembling but her eyes steady. We cannot stay on the road, Elias replied. He tossed the crumpled ball of paper into the dust. Every bounty hunter from El Paso to Yuma will be looking for a scarred man and a red-haired woman. We have to go where they cannot follow. He turned his horse toward the north, toward the jagged, purple teeth of the mountains that tore at the sky. Where? Clara asked. The Gila, Elias said. The Devil's Garden. They left the road and vanished into the wilderness. The terrain they entered was a place where God seemed to have tested his wrath. It was a landscape of broken earth, of dry gulches that twisted like scars across the land, and volcanic rock that shredded the hooves of horses and the boots of men. This was rattlesnake country, where the reptiles coiled in the shadows of the mesquite, their dry warning rattles sounding like shaken seeds in a gourd. For days, they rode through a silence so profound it felt heavy. The heat was a physical weight, pressing down on their shoulders. They rationed their water, taking only small sips that barely wet their tongues. Their lips cracked and bled. The dust settled into the lines of their faces, turning them into statues of the earth itself. They were hunted. Clara could feel it. It was a prickling on the back of her neck, a shadow on the horizon that did not move with the wind. Twice they saw riders on the distant ridges, silhouettes against the blinding sun. Each time, Elias led them into the deep, twisting arroyos, hiding in the cutbanks until the danger passed. They did not light fires at night. They ate cold beans and dry jerky, huddled together under a single blanket as the desert temperature plummeted. Elias barely slept. He sat with his back against a rock, his pistol in his lap, his eyes scanning the darkness. You must sleep, Clara whispered to him on the fourth night. They were camped in a shallow cave near a dried-up wash. I will sleep when we are high up, Elias answered. Down here, we are prey. You will die of exhaustion before a bullet finds you, she argued gently. Reaching out to touch his knee, he looked at her, his eyes rimmed with red, exhausted and hollow. If I sleep, Clara, I see Kincaid's face. I see Lockett coming for you. I cannot close my eyes. Clara moved closer, wrapping her arms around his rigid body. Then rest your eyes. Elias, I will watch. I will be your sentry. He resisted at first, but eventually, his body betrayed him. He slumped against her shoulder, his breathing deepening into a ragged rhythm. Clara sat awake through the long hours of the night, clutching the heavy Colt revolver he had taught her to use, watching the moon crawl across the sky. She was terrified, but beneath the fear was a strange, cold clarity. She was not the girl who had arrived in a silk dress. She was a creature of this wild land now, forged in its fires. On the 6th day, the land began to change. The scrub brush gave way to twisted juniper and pinon pine. The air grew thinner and sharper. They were climbing into the Gila Mountains, a fortress of stone and forest that rose out of the desert floor. The path Elias chose was not a trail. It was a deer run, a narrow ledge of rock that skirted the edge of dizzying cliffs, 1,000 feet below. The river was a ribbon of silver. The horses picked their way carefully, their ears flicking back and forth. "We are close," Elias said. He was scanning the cliffs above them, looking for something Clara could not see. "Close to what?" Clara asked, clutching her saddle horn as the mare navigated a particularly steep switchback. "Sanctuary," he said. They rounded a bend where the rock wall fell away to reveal a hidden box canyon, lush with green grass and a stand of aspen trees that shivered in the mountain breeze. A small stream tumbled down the rock face, feeding a pool of clear water. But standing at the entrance to this paradise was a figure. She stood motionless atop a boulder, a silhouette against the sun. She held a lever-action rifle, the barrel resting easily in the crook of her arm. She was small, dressed in buckskins that had been dyed a deep ochre, with moccasins that came up to her knees. Her hair was gray, braided tightly and wound around her head. Elias stopped his horse. He raised his empty hands slowly. "Danzo!" he called out, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. The woman did not lower the rifle. She watched them for a long moment, her eyes like black obsidian. Then she tilted her head. "You look like a dead man. Elias McCrae," she called back. Her English was accented but clear, sharp as a knife. "I feel like one. Nalina," Elias replied. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Can a ghost come in to drink?" The woman lowered the rifle. "If the ghost brings good company, come." They rode into the valley. As they dismounted, Clara's legs nearly gave way. Nalina was there instantly, her small hand gripping Clara's elbow with surprising strength. "Steady, Sky Woman," Nalina said. Clara looked at her, startled, up close. Nalina's face was a map of wrinkles, weathered by 70 years of sun and wind, but her eyes were young and fierce. "Sky Woman?" Clara asked breathlessly. Nalina reached up and touched a strand of Clara's red hair, which had escaped her bonnet and was blazing in the sunlight. "Hair like the sunset, eyes like the storm clearing. You carry the sky with you." Elias was stripping the saddles from the horses. He looked over the seat of the saddle at the two women. "Nalina sees things others do not," he said. "She is a Dayin, a medicine woman, and the only reason I am still walking this earth." That evening, as the twilight turned the canyon walls to plum and indigo, they sat around a small fire that Nalina had built from aromatic cedar. They ate stew made of venison and wild onions, the best meal Clara had tasted in weeks. "How do you know each other?" Clara asked, looking between Elias and the Apache woman. Elias stared into the fire. 10 years ago, I was a corporal. We were patrolling near the border. We found a small band of Apache gathering mezcal. They were old men and women, not warriors." He paused, his jaw tightening. "The lieutenant, he was a man who enjoyed cruelty. He wanted to make an example. He ordered the men to burn their baskets, to humiliate them." Elias looked up at Nalina. He grabbed Nalina. He had a knife. He was going to cut her hair. For an Apache woman, that is a mourning, a violation. Nalina stirred the fire, her face impassive. "He wanted to take my spirit." "I stepped in," Elias said softly. "I put my carbine against his chest and told him to let her go. He turned on me, pistol whipped me, but in the confusion, Nalina and the others got away. The lieutenant had me tied to a wagon wheel for 2 days without water, but I reckoned it was a fair trade." Nalina looked at Clara. "He fell. The fever took him later from the wounds. I found him in the rocks where his army left him to rot. I brought him here. I pulled the sickness from his blood." She looked at Elias with a gaze that was both maternal and judging. "He has a good heart, but it is heavy. He carries too many stones in his sack." The days in the canyon were a balm to their battered souls. The world of bounties and Archibald Lockett seemed to fade, blocked out by the granite walls. Clara spent her time with Nalina. The older woman taught her which plants healed and which killed. They gathered sage and yarrow, grinding them into pastes on flat stones. "You have soft hands," Nalina observed one afternoon as they were skinning a rabbit. "They were softer once," Clara said, looking at her calluses. "I hated them then. I thought they were useless." "A woman's hands are never useless," Nalina said sternly. "Men draw lines on the earth with guns and fences. They say, 'This is mine, that is yours.' But women, we bleed into the earth. We feed it. We birth the men who draw the lines. Survival is not about fighting. Sky woman, it is about enduring. It is about being like the water that cuts the stone." "I do not feel like water," Clara admitted. "I feel like glass, waiting to shatter." "Glass cuts," Nalina said. "Remember that, even broken. You are dangerous." She looked deep into Clara's eyes. "You love him, the soldier." "Yes," Clara said simply. "He is my husband." "He is a wolf caught in a trap," Nalina said. "He chews his own leg to get free. You must be the one to bind the wound, or he will bleed to death." The peace of the valley could not hold back the weather forever. On their 5th night, a storm rolled in over the mountains. It was a violent, crashing tempest. Thunder shook the ground, echoing off the canyon walls like artillery fire. Lightning turned the night into a strobe of blinding white and pitch black. They were sheltering in Nalina's lodge, a structure of poles and hides built against the rock wall. Nalina had gone to a smaller shelter to chant to the thunder spirits, leaving Clara and Elias alone. Elias was pacing. Every crack of thunder made him flinch. His skin was pale, his eyes wide and unseeing. He was back in the war, back in the smoke. "Elias," Clara said, sitting on the furs. "Come sit, it is just a storm." "It sounds like the cannons," he muttered. "At the Rosebud, the ground shook like this." He stopped pacing and slumped against the wall, sliding down until he was sitting on the dirt floor, his head in his hands. He was trembling violently. Clara crawled over to him. She knelt before him, placing her hands on his knees. "Elias, look at me. You are in the Gila. You are with me." He looked up, and his face was twisted with a grief so raw it frightened her. "I killed him," he whispered. Clara frowned. "You were a soldier." "Elias, you killed many men. It was war." "No," he gasped. He shook his head. "Not like the others. The others were distant. Bullets. Smoke. This one was close." He grabbed her hands, his grip painful. "It was a raid, a village in the winter. I went into a lodge. There was a warrior there. He was wounded. He had no weapon. He looked at me. He was just a boy. Clara, maybe 16. He looked at me, and he knew he was going to die." Elias's voice cracked, tears spilling down his scarred cheeks. "I should have walked away, or I should have shot him clean, but the rage, the madness of the noise. I dropped my rifle. I put my hands on his throat." He held up his hands, staring at them with horror. "I strangled him. I looked into his eyes while the light went out of them. I felt his life stop under my thumbs. It took so long. God, it took so long." He began to sob, a terrible, wrenching sound that tore at his throat. "I am a monster. I am not a man. I am a thing that kills boys in the dark. How can you touch me? How can you let these hands touch you?" Clara felt a chill run through her, a horror at the violence of the confession. But then she looked at him. She saw the man who had ridden into a sandstorm to save her, the man who had tended her fever, the man who had beaten a giant in the dirt to protect her dignity. She did not pull away. She reached out and took his hands, the hands that had strangled a boy, the hands that had saved her life. She brought them to her lips. She kissed the rough palms. She kissed the trembling fingers. "These are the hands that held me when I was sick," she whispered fiercely. "These are the hands that built a fire to keep me warm. These are the hands that hold me when I sleep. They are stained," he wept. "Then let me wash them," she said. "Let me wash them with my love. You are not that moment, Elias. You are not that sin. You are the man who regretted it. You are the man who has carried the weight of it for 10 years. She pulled him toward her. Forgive yourself, please, for me, for us. He collapsed into her, burying his face in her neck, crying like a child. Clara held him, rocking him back and forth as the thunder raged outside. She held him until the sobs turned to shuddering breaths, until the storm in the sky began to drift east. When he finally pulled back, his eyes were clear, though red-rimmed. He looked at her with a mixture of awe and desperation. You stayed, he whispered. I told you the worst of me, and you stayed. I'm not going anywhere, she said. He kissed her then, and it was not gentle. It was a collision. It was a desperate need to affirm life in the face of the death he carried. He pulled her down onto the furs, his hands moving over her with a feverish intensity. Clara met him with equal force. She tore at the buttons of his shirt, needing to feel his skin against hers. She needed to be the anchor that kept him from drifting away into his memories. That night, their lovemaking was a battle against the dark. It was fierce and primitive. There was no shyness, no hesitation. They moved together in the flickering light of the dying fire, bodies slick with sweat, locked together as if they could merge into a single being. Elias buried himself in her, groaning her name like a prayer. Clara arched into him, wrapping her legs around him, pulling him deeper. Every thrust was a denial of the past. I am here, his body said. I am alive. I have you. She answered with her touch. You are forgiven. You are loved. They lay together long after the storm had passed, the silence of the canyon returning. The air was cool and smelled of rain and wet sage. Elias lay with his head on Clara's chest, his breathing slow and deep. He was asleep. For the first time in weeks, he was truly asleep. Clara lay awake, watching the smoke hole in the roof of the lodge, where a single star was visible. She felt a profound sense of holiness. Not the holiness of a church, with its clean lines and judgmental silence, but the holiness of the earth, messy, blood-stained, violent, and incredibly, resiliently beautiful. She stroked Elias's hair, her hand resting protectively over the scar on his temple. She was Sky Woman. She was the wife of a broken soldier, and she knew, with a certainty that settled in her bones like iron, that she would kill anyone who tried to take this peace away from them. Outside, the wind whispered through the aspen trees, a soft, mournful sound that carried a warning. The world below was still waiting. Archibald Lockett was still waiting, but for tonight, they were safe. For tonight, they were whole. The peace of the hidden valley was a fragile thing, held together by the whispered prayers of the aspen trees and the silence of the stone. It shattered on a Tuesday morning, not with a gunshot, but with the quiet snap of a twig. Nalina returned from her morning scout before the sun had fully crested the canyon rim. She did not walk with her usual fluid grace. She moved with a stiff, urgent quickness. She found Elias cleaning his saddle by the stream, while Clara washed a shirt in the cold water. They are here, Nalina said. Her voice was flat, devoid of fear but heavy with certainty. Elias dropped the stirrup leather he had been oiling. He stood up slowly, his hand instinctively going to the colt at his hip. How close? 2 ridges over, Nalina said. 5 men, 4 white men with repeaters, 1 tracker. Half-blood, Comanche by the look of his horse knots. He's reading the ground like a book. Elias, he found where you crossed the shale. He will find the entrance to this place by noon. Clara stood up, her hands dripping wet, the cold water forgotten. The sanctuary was dissolving around her. The golden light of the morning suddenly felt like a spotlight exposing them to a firing squad. We have to fight, Elias said, his jaw setting hard. We can bottle them up in the pass. Pick them off, one by one. You have 6 bullets left in your belt, Nalina reminded him sharply. And they have long rifles. They will sit on the rim and starve you out, or shoot you down like dogs in a pit. You cannot win this fight with lead. Elias looked at Clara. He looked at the fear that had returned to her eyes, erasing the peace of the last week. He looked at the bruises fading on her arms, the calluses on her hands. He realized then that running into the wilderness would only delay the inevitable. Archibald Lockett had money, and money bought time, men, and bullets. It bought persistence. "We are done running," Elias said. But his voice was different now. It wasn't the resignation of a beaten man. It was the resolve of a man changing the battlefield. "What do you mean?" Clara asked. "We go north," Elias said, turning to look toward the distant peaks. "To Santa Fe. It is a territorial capital. There are federal judges there, men appointed by Washington, not bought by local cattle barons." "You want to walk into a city?" Clara asked, incredulous. "With a bounty on your head?" "I want to stop being prey," Elias said. "I want to turn around and show our teeth. Lockett claims you are his property. He claims I am a thief. We go to a judge. We tell the truth. We charge him with involuntary servitude. We charge him with assault. They will hang you before you ever step foot in a courtroom," Clara whispered. "Maybe," Elias admitted. He walked over to her and took her wet hands in his. "But out here, they will just shoot us and leave us for the buzzards. At least in Santa Fe, there will be witnesses." He looked deep into her eyes. "I am tired of hiding. Clara, I want to give you a life where you do not have to jump at every shadow. Are you with me?" Clara looked at the scar on his face. She thought of the long nights in the desert, the way he had held her, the way he had washed the floors of her soul clean of Archibald Lockett's filth. She realized that safety was an illusion. There was only the choice of how they faced the end. "If we die," she said, her voice steady and clear, "let it be with our names known." They packed in 10 minutes. Nalina gave them dried venison and a small pouch of crushed willow bark for pain. She did not hug them. She simply placed her hand on Elias's chest, over his heart. "Ride with the wind, ghost," she said. Then she looked at Clara. "Be the storm, sky woman." They rode out of the canyon not by the main trail, but by a treacherous goat path Nalina showed them, slipping out the back door of the mountains just as the bounty hunters were finding the front. They rode hard for 2 days, pushing the horses to their limits. They skirted the high timber, sticking to the rocky draws where their tracks would be lost in the gravel. They spoke little. The tension was a third rider in the saddle with them, heavy and suffocating. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, they reached the Rio Puerco. It was a dry riverbed, a scar of cracked mud and sand that wound through a landscape of mesquite and cholla cactus. The banks were high and steep, eroded by flash floods. "We cross here," Elias said, reining in his roar. He scanned the far bank, his eyes narrowing against the glare. "Once we are across, it is a straight shot to the chaotic lands south of the city. We can lose them there." He spurred his horse down the embankment. Clara followed, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The horse's hooves crunched loudly on the dry riverbed. Every sound seemed magnified in the stillness. They were halfway across when the world exploded. There was no warning, no shout, just the sharp, cracking whip of a high-powered rifle. Sand erupted in a geyser 3 feet to Clara's left. "Ride!" Elias screamed, wheeling his horse around. A second shot rang out, echoing off the canyon walls. Clara's mare screamed, rearing up in panic. Clara clung to the saddle horn, fighting to keep her seat. "Up the bank!" Elias roared. He drew his pistol and fired blindly at the ridge above them, trying to create cover. He spurred his horse between Clara and the hidden shooter, placing his own body as a shield. The 3rd shot did not miss. It hit Elias with a sickening, meaty thud. His leg kicked out of the stirrup, and his body jerked violently to the side. A spray of bright crimson blood painted the dusty flank of his horse. "Elias!" Clara screamed. He did not fall. With a groan that was more animal than human, he grabbed the saddle horn, righting himself through sheer will. "Go!" he shouted at her, his face draining of color instantly. "Go, Clara!" He slapped the rump of her mare. The horse bolted, scrambling up the steep shale of the far bank. Elias followed, swaying dangerously in the saddle. Another bullet whined past Clara's ear, cutting a lock of her hair. They crested the bank and plunged into a thicket of dense mesquite and prickly pear. Elias was losing blood fast. Clara could see it soaking his denim trousers, turning the fabric black. He was leaning precariously to the left. "Hold on," she cried, pulling alongside him and grabbing his reins. "Just hold on, Elias." They rode for another mile, crashing through the brush, the thorns tearing at their clothes and skin. The shots behind them faded, but the sound of pursuing hoofbeats drifted on the wind. The bounty hunters were coming down the bank. Elias slumped forward, his head hitting the horse's mane. I cannot," he gasped. He slid from the saddle. He hit the ground hard, rolling into the dust. Clara vaulted off her mare before it had fully stopped. She ran to him, dropping to her knees in the dirt. "Elias," she sobbed, turning him over. His eyes were glassy. The bullet had taken him in the outer thigh. The wound was ugly, a ragged hole that pulsed with dark blood. He was bleeding to death. "Leave me," he whispered, his teeth gritted in agony. "Take the fresh horse. Ride. You can make the town." "No," Clara said. The word was a growl. "No." She ripped the hem of her petticoat, tearing a long strip of white cotton. She grabbed a sturdy stick from the ground, with shaking but determined hands. She tied the cloth above the wound and twisted the stick, tightening the tourniquet until the flow of blood slowed to a trickle. Elias cried out, a sharp, guttural sound, and then his head lolled back. He had passed out from the pain. "You do not get to quit," Clara hissed at him, tears streaming down her face. "You do not get to leave me." She looked around. The brush was too thin here. They needed cover. About 200 yards away, she saw a cluster of boulders forming a small, shadowed alcove near the base of a cliff. She could not lift him. He was a big man. Dead weight now. Clara grabbed him by the armpits. She dug her heels into the dirt. She pulled. It was agonizing. Every inch was a battle. Her boots slipped in the loose gravel. The cactus thorns tore at her skirts and dug into her ankles. The sun beat down on her back like a physical lash. "He carried you," a voice in her head screamed. "He carried you when you were sick. He fought for you. Pull." She dragged him through the dirt, her breath coming in ragged gasps that burned her lungs. She dragged him over rocks that scraped her knees raw. She dragged him until her muscles spasmed and her vision blurred with black spots. She got him to the rocks. She collapsed beside him for a moment, her chest heaving, her heart feeling like it would burst. But there was no time to rest. She checked the wound. The bleeding had stopped, but he was pale as ash. His skin was clammy. He needed a doctor. He needed a surgeon to get the lead out and stitch the artery, or he would die of infection or blood loss before sunrise. She looked at the horses. They were blown, their sides heaving foam. "Stay here," she whispered to Elias's unconscious form. She brushed the hair from his forehead, leaving a smear of his own blood on his skin. "I am coming back. I swear it." She took his pistol and tucked it into her waistband. She took the canteen and left it by his head. Then she mounted the paint mare, which seemed to have a little more fight left than the roan. She turned the horse toward the east, where she had seen the smoke of a chimney earlier that day. Clara rode like a woman possessed. She did not feel the exhaustion. She did not feel the thirst. She felt only the cold, hard terror of losing the other half of her soul. She reached the settlement an hour later. It wasn't much of a town, just a dusty collection of shacks, a general store, and a saloon with a peeling sign that read, "The Last Drop." She rode down the main street, a wild apparition. Her hair was a tangled mane of red fire. Her dress was torn to ribbons, revealing her dust-coated petticoats. Her hands and arms were covered in dried blood. Elias's blood. She pulled the horse up in front of the general store, where a group of men were sitting on crates, whittling and spitting tobacco. "I need a doctor!" she screamed, her voice cracking. "Is there a doctor in this town?" The men stopped their whittling. They looked her up and down, their eyes lingering on her torn bodice, her wild appearance. They saw the blood, but they didn't see a lady. They saw trouble. They saw a woman who had been used to it. One of the men, a thick-necked miner with a dirty beard, laughed. "Looks like you had a rough night, darling. Your pimp beat you up?" Clara stared at him, shocked. "My husband," she gasped. "My husband is shot." He's dying. Please, I need help. Husband, another man sneered. I ain't never seen a wife look like that. You look like a camp follower who got caught stealing. Please, Clara begged, sliding from the horse. Her legs gave way, and she hit the dust. She scrambled up, clutching the porch railing. He is bleeding. I have money. I can pay. We don't want your whore money here, the first man said, spitting a stream of brown juice near her boot. Move along, girl. Before the sheriff comes and locks you up for vagrancy. Clara stood there, swaying, the cruelty of it hitting her harder than the heat. They wouldn't help her. They saw a woman alone, bloody and disheveled, and they judged her unworthy of breath. You heathens, she whispered. Then she screamed it. You heathens! A man is dying! Get out of here, the miner shouted, standing up. Leave her be, you jackals! The voice came from the shadows of the store's doorway. An older woman stepped out. She was dressed in severe black bombazine, despite the heat, and she leaned on a cane made of polished hickory. Her face was sharp, her eyes like flint, but they held none of the men's leering malice. Mrs. Holloway, the miner muttered, sitting back down. She is just some trash off the trail. She is a human being in distress. The widow snapped. She looked at Clara. You said he was shot. Yes, Clara sobbed, rushing toward the woman. In the leg, about 5 miles back. Near the rock slide. Is the bullet in or out? In. I tied it off, but he is cold. So cold. Mrs. Holloway nodded. She turned to a young boy who was sweeping the boardwalk. Jimmy, go fetch Doc Evans. Tell him if he is drunk. I will pour a bucket of ice water on him myself. Then hitch my buckboard. She looked back at Clara. Come inside, child. Drink some water. Then you are going to show us where he is. The ride back to the rocks was a blur of anxiety. Doc Evans was a shaking, terrified little man who smelled of gin. But Mrs. Holloway bullied him into competence. When they found Elias, he was barely breathing. The shadows had stretched long across the desert floor, and the coyotes were beginning to sing. They loaded him into the back of the buckboard. Clara held his head in her lap the entire way back, whispering to him, urging him to stay, to fight. The surgery was performed on Mrs. Holloway's dining table. Clara stood by the lamp, holding it steady while the doctor dug for the lead. She did not look away. She watched the blood, the steel, the agony on Elias's unconscious face. When the bullet clattered into the metal basin, she finally let out the breath she had been holding for 6 hours. He is strong, Doc Evans mumbled, wiping his hands on a rag. The artery wasn't severed, just nicked. He lost a lot of blood, though it will be a miracle if the fever doesn't take him. He does not need miracles, Clara said, smoothing the hair back from Elias's damp forehead. He has me. For 3 days, Elias hovered between worlds. Clara did not leave his side. She slept in a chair by the bed, waking at his slightest movement. Mrs. Holloway brought her broth and strong coffee, asking no questions, only offering silent support. When Elias finally woke, his eyes were clear. He looked at the clean sheets, the sunlight streaming through the window, and then at Clara. We are alive, he rasped. Yes, Clara said, taking his hand. We are the bounty hunters? They lost the trail, or they think you died in the brush. We are safe for now. Elias tried to sit up, but winced and fell back. We have to move, as soon as I can ride. No, Clara said. You cannot ride, not for weeks. Clara, Lockett will... I know, she interrupted. Her voice was hard, final. I know he will keep coming. That is why we are sticking to the plan. We are going to Santa Fe, but we are going in a wagon, and we are going to finish this. She stood up, and at that moment, she looked 10 feet tall. I am done running. Elias, I am done being hunted. I am going to drag Archibald Lockett into the light and let the world see him for what he is. A week later, they arrived in Santa Fe. It was a bustling city of adobe and brick, filled with politicians, soldiers, and merchants. It felt foreign and loud after the silence of the desert. They found a room in a quiet boarding house. Elias was still weak, limping heavily on a cane, his face gaunt, but he put on his best shirt, shaved his face clean around the beard, and went with her. Finding a lawyer was not easy. Most laughed at them. A rancher suing a cattle baron, a mail-order bride accusing her husband of slavery? It was unheard of. It was suicide. But Clara was relentless. She asked around, listening to the whispers of the town. She heard of a woman, a spinster from the East, a suffragette who had passed the bar in Illinois and came west because no firm in Chicago would hire her. Her name was Mary Catherine O'Malley. Her office was a small, dusty room above a bakery, smelling of yeast and old law books. She was a small woman with spectacles and ink-stained fingers. She listened to Clara's story without interrupting. She looked at the bruises that still lingered on Clara's soul. She looked at Elias, standing protective and broken in the corner. "Archibald Lockett is a powerful man," Miss O'Malley said, leaning back in her chair. "He dines with the governor. He owns half the judges in the territory." "Is he above the law?" Clara asked. "In New Mexico. Often," the lawyer replied dryly. "But you said you want to file in federal court, on the grounds of involuntary servitude, the 13th Amendment." Miss O'Malley took off her spectacles and polished them slowly. "It is a bold strategy, dangerous. If we lose, he will take you back, and he will hang your husband." "He is not her husband," Elias said from the corner. "Not by law." Miss O'Malley looked at him. "And that is the other problem. You are living in sin. Technically, the jury will not like that." "We are married in our hearts," Clara said firmly. "And God was our witness in the desert." The lawyer smiled. A sharp, shark-like grin. "God doesn't sit on the jury, Mrs. McCrae. But I do like fighting, and I detest Archibald Lockett. He foreclosed on a widow I represented last year. Took her farm for pennies." She slammed her hand on the desk. "I will take the case, but you need to be ready. They will drag your name through the mud. They will call you a whore, a thief, a liar. They will ask about your nights with this man." Clara looked at Elias. She saw the shame flicker in his eyes, the fear that his love was the thing that would condemn her. Elias limped forward. He placed his hand on Clara's shoulder. He looked at the lawyer, then down at the woman he loved. "Let them ask," Elias said. His voice was rough, but it didn't waver. "If they ask what I am to you, Clara, tell them everything. Tell them I am the man who stole you. Tell them I am the man who loves you. Tell them I would burn the world down to keep you warm." Clara covered his hand with hers. She looked at the lawyer. "File the papers." Clara said, "We are ready." The federal courthouse in Santa Fe was a building of imposing brick and stone, designed to remind the wild territory that the reach of Washington extended even to the dust. On the day of Whitmore v. Lockett, the air inside the courtroom was thick enough to choke a man. It smelled of unwashed bodies, stale tobacco, and the electric tension of a storm waiting to break. Every bench was packed. The story of the runaway bride and the scarred cowboy had traveled through the territory like a prairie fire, growing with every retelling. Miners, ranchers, and curious socialites from the capital whispered behind their hands, their eyes darting between the plaintiff's table and the defense. Archibald Lockett sat at the defense table like a king holding court. He wore a suit of fine gray wool, his boots polished to a mirror shine. He looked calm, even bored, leaning back in his chair with an air of untouchable arrogance. He did not look at Clara. To him, she was already a discarded asset, a nuisance to be swatted away with the heavy hand of his wealth. Clara sat beside Mary Catherine O'Malley. She wore a simple dress of gray cotton that she had sewn herself in the nights leading up to the trial. Her red hair was pulled back severely, revealing the pale determination of her face. Elias sat behind the bar, his cane resting against his knee. He looked out of place indoors, a creature of the open range trapped in a box of polished wood, but his eyes never left the back of Clara's head. Judge Harrison, a man with a face like a bulldog and a reputation for absolute intolerance of nonsense, banged his gavel. The sound cracked through the room like a gunshot. This court is now in session, the judge rumbled. We are here to hear the matter of Clara Whitmore regarding allegations of involuntary servitude, assault, and unlawful imprisonment against Mr. Archibald Lockett. The trial began with the slow, grinding machinery of the law. Lockett's lawyer, a slick man from Denver named Mr. Sterling, moved with the grace of a viper. He painted a picture of Archibald Lockett as a benevolent benefactor, a lonely man who had sought companionship and been swindled by a conniving, ungrateful woman. She accepted his money, Sterling thundered, pacing before the jury. She accepted the passage. She accepted clothing. And in return, she offered nothing but deceit. She claimed she was treated as a servant. Is a wife not a helpmate? Is it not the duty of a woman to keep her husband's home? When Clara took the stand, the room went deadly silent. She placed her hand on the Bible, her palms sweating, and swore to tell the truth. Miss O'Malley stood up. She did not thunder. She spoke with a quiet, razor-sharp precision. Miss Whitmore, why did you leave the Double L Ranch? Clara looked at the jury, 12 men, faces hardened by the sun. I left because I was not a wife, she said, her voice steady. I was livestock, Mr. Lockett told me on my first day that he had purchased me. He told me I was an investment. I was made to scrub floors until my hands bled. I was forbidden from eating at the table. I was locked in at night. Did he ever strike you? He grabbed me, Clara said, looking directly at Archibald. For the first time, Lockett shifted in his chair. He told me he owned the debt of my flesh. He tried to take what he believed he had bought. Sterling jumped up on cross-examination, attacking like a wolf sensing weakness. You ran away with a drifter, didn't you? A man fired for insubordination? You shared a bed with him in the desert? You lived with him in sin in a border town? I survived with him, Clara shot back, her eyes flashing. Elias McCrae treated me with more honor in a dirt cave than Mr. Lockett ever did in his mansion. Honor, Sterling scoffed. You are a fallen woman, Miss Whitmore. You are a thief who stole a horse and a dress and ran off with a criminal, the crowd murmured. Clara felt the shame rising, the old aristocratic fear of scandal, but she crushed it down. She was not that girl anymore. Then came the witnesses, Mrs. Halloway, the widow from the settlement where Elias had been treated, took the stand. She leaned on her hickory cane and glared at Lockett with open disdain. I saw them, Mrs. Halloway testified. That girl dragged a 200-pound man 3 miles through cactus and rock. She had blood on her hands and fire in her eyes. You call her a whore, I call her a wife. And I have buried 2 husbands, so I know the difference. Sheriff Miller had ridden all the way from the border town. He sat uneasily in the witness chair, twisting his hat in his hands. I saw Lockett's foreman, Vance Kincaid, attack her in the street, the sheriff said. Grabbed her like she was a stray dog, the cowboy, McCrae. He fought him. He didn't fight like a man looking for trouble. He fought like a man defending his home. But it was the final witness who silenced the room. When the bailiff opened the doors, a gasp ran through the gallery. Nalina walked in. She wore her buckskins, clean and brushed, and a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She did not look at the floor. She did not look at the lawyers. She looked straight at the judge. Sterling objected immediately. Your Honor, this is an Indian, a savage. Her testimony is inadmissible. Overruled, Judge Harrison barked. In this territory, if you breathe air, you can speak the truth. Sit down, Mr. Sterling. Nalina took the stand. She did not swear on the Bible. She simply nodded to the judge. Tell us what you saw, Miss O'Malley said. I saw 2 people hunted like deer, Nalina said. Her voice was low, resonant, carrying the cadence of the wind in the canyons. I saw the bounty hunters. They were not lawmen. They were killers. They tracked blood. They did not want justice. They wanted a trophy. She pointed a withered finger at Archibald Lockett. This man has a sickness of the spirit, she said calmly. He thinks he can eat the world and it will fill him. But he is empty. The Sky Woman and the Ghost, they are full. They carry the life he cannot buy. Lockett stood up, his face turning a violent shade of purple. "I will not sit here and be lectured by a squaw. Sit down, Mr. Lockett," the judge roared, slamming his gavel so hard the handle splintered. "Or I will have you in irons." The closing arguments were brief. Sterling appealed to the sanctity of property and contract. Miss O'Malley appealed to the 13th Amendment, arguing that debt bondage was slavery by another name, and that no piece of paper gave a man the right to own a human being. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. When they returned, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the floorboards. "We find for the plaintiff," the jury foreman said. A roar went up from the gallery. The judge hammered for order. "Archibald Lockett," Judge Harrison said, looking over his spectacles, "you are hereby ordered to pay Miss Whitmore the sum of $2,000 in damages for labor and emotional distress. Furthermore, I am issuing a permanent injunction. You are barred from seeking contact with her or Mr. McCrae. And let me be clear, sir, if I hear of you soliciting another bride through the mail, I will have you jailed for trafficking. Get out of my courtroom." Lockett stood frozen. The disgrace was absolute. The whispers in the room turned to jeers. He gathered his papers, shot one look of pure venom at Clara, and stormed out, his empire of fear cracking at the foundation. Clara sat still, tears streaming down her face. It was over. The hunter had become the hunted, and the prey had become free. Outside the courthouse, the air was cool and sweet. The crowd had dispersed, leaving Clara and Elias alone on the wide stone steps. Elias was leaning on his cane, watching the last of the light fade from the Sangre de Cristo mountains. He looked tired, but the tension that had held his shoulders for 10 years was gone. Clara walked over to him. She took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "We won," she whispered. "You won," Elias corrected gently. "You stood up to the devil and you made him blink." He turned to face her. He let go of her hand and reached into his pocket. Clara held her breath, expecting a ring, perhaps something simple he had bought with the meager coins they had left. But his hand came out empty. He took both of her hands in his. He looked at her with a raw, terrifying vulnerability. "I have no gold, Clara," he said. "I have no land yet. I have a bad leg and a past full of ghosts. I cannot give you a mansion. I cannot give you the life you were born to." "I do not want that life," Clara said. "I know," Elias said. "But I have to say this. The law says you are free. The judge says you are your own woman." He squeezed her hands. "No one owns you. Clara, not Lockett, not the world, not even me. You are free to walk away right now. You have money now. You could go back east. You could start over." He took a breath, his voice trembling. "But I would give everything, my breath, my blood, every day I have left, just to walk beside you. Not in front of you, not behind you, beside you." Clara looked at him. She saw the cowboy who had found her in a barn. She saw the man who had taught her to shoot. She saw the lover who had wept in her arms. She laughed, a sound of pure joy that startled a pigeon from the eaves. "You foolish man," she said, tears spilling over again. "Do you think I fought the whole world just to walk alone?" She reached up and cupped his face, pulling him down to her. "Take me home, Elias, take me home." They did not go back east. They went high. With the money from the judgment, they bought a parcel of land in the foothills of the San Juan Mountains, where the air was thin and clear and the aspen trees turned to gold in the autumn. It was raw land, wild and untamed. They built their life with their own hands. Elias felled the timber, his leg growing stronger with every swing of the axe, though he would always carry a limp, a reminder of the river crossing. Clara stripped the logs and mixed the chinking mud. They built a cabin. It was not a mansion. It had 2 rooms and a stone chimney that drew perfectly. They built a corral for the horses. They planted a garden of hardy vegetables that could survive the frost. It was hard work. Their hands grew rougher, their faces more lined by the sun. But it was their work. Every fence post they drove was a declaration of their freedom. Every fire they lit was a victory. Years passed. The story of the court case faded into legend, becoming just another tall tale told in saloons. But the reality of their life grew deep roots. Clara did not stop with her own freedom. She began to write. She wrote letters for the women in the valley who could not read. She wrote to judges and newspapers. When a young German bride ran away from an abusive husband in the valley below, she came to Clara's door. Clara took her in, fed her, and stood on the porch with a Winchester rifle until the husband rode away. She became a beacon. Women whispered her name to one another like a secret code. Go to the high cabin. Go to the red-haired woman. And then there was the evening under the cottonwood tree. It was late summer, 10 years after they had ridden out of the Double L Ranch. The sun was setting, painting the sky in strokes of violent violet and burning orange, the kind of sunset that only the West could produce. Clara lay on a blanket beneath the massive, twisting branches of the old tree that stood near the creek. She was older now. There were silver strands mixing with the red of her hair. The lines around her eyes were etched deep from squinting at the sun and from laughter. Elias lay beside her. His hair was more gray than black now, and the scar on his face had faded to a thin white line. He was cleaning a pair of spectacles. He needed them for reading now, though he still refused to admit it. He put the spectacles away and rolled onto his side. Looking at her, he reached out and placed his hand on the swell of her stomach. She was heavy with children, a late blessing they had thought would never come. The baby kicked against his palm. Elias smiled, the skin crinkling around his eyes. It was a smile of absolute peace, a look that the younger, haunted Elias could never have imagined. He is restless tonight, Elias murmured. She, Clara corrected, placing her hand over his. She is listening to the wind. Is that what it is? Elias asked. I thought maybe she was ready to start riding. She will ride soon enough, Clara said. And you will teach her, just like you taught me. Elias leaned in and kissed her forehead. I will teach her to shoot first, then ride. Clara laughed softly. She rested her head on his chest, listening to the steady, strong beat of his heart. She looked out at the ridgeline, where the purple shadows were lengthening. She thought of the silk dress she had arrived in. She thought of the dust storm. She thought of the fear that had once tasted like copper in her mouth. It all felt like a story that had happened to someone else. Here, under the vast, indifferent sky, they had carved out a space for tenderness. They had defied the cruelty of the world not with power, but with the stubborn, unyielding force of their love. Elias? She whispered. I am here, he answered, his arm tightening around her. We made it, she said. We are home. Yes, the cowboy whispered to his bride, as the first star appeared in the darkening sky. We are home. Thank you for listening to this story. I hope you enjoyed the journey of Clara and Elias across the American West. It has been a pleasure to bring this tale of resilience and love to life for you. I would love to hear from you. Please leave a comment below telling me where you are listening from in the world. It is always fascinating to see how far these stories travel. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing to From Wild West so you never miss an adventure. Share your thoughts. Did the ending satisfy you? What was your favorite moment between Clara and Elias? Please share your thoughts in English in the comments section. Until next time, keep writing.